Hello there. Time for another video. Today, we shall discuss progress. Now, for those who think of progress, usually the first thing that comes to mind is likely technology or achievements. So, inventions. For example, railways were a massive invention and had great influence when it came to modernizing travel. For example, in the US especially, it was rail which allowed what you'd now call the Rust Belt or the Great Lakes region to prosper, because through rail it was far easier to get goods to and from the main cities. In fact, many cities thrived because of the connection to the rail. For example, Chicago grew greatly because it was one of the main rail stops. Now, that is one type. Hold up, it would appear that I lack much light. Excuse me while I fix that. There we go. Playing not much better for you, but for me, it helped a bit. So, anyways, back to the point. So, inventions are one. Others might think of societal progress. For example, the very idea of a constitution. Now, for some levels, there has always been this idea of a constitution. It's basically a way to delineate what the government is and is not allowed to do. However, when it comes down to it, the idea of a constitution specifically meant to not just define what the government can and can't do, but also to protect the people from the government is a very new concept. It came with what is called the Enlightenment, especially. Now, there's another type of progress that some people are aware of, and that is just general economic growth. So, for example, $1 trillion. Do you know when the United States finally hit that? The largest economy in the world. Do you know when? It wasn't in 1900. If I remember correctly, it was around the 1960s or 70s that we finally hit it. That alone is massive, because the economy of the world has grown steadily and steadily, to the point where hearing $1 trillion, now you can think of many, many countries who have reached that, especially in the developed world. For example, Japan is one of them, as is France, Germany, the UK, many countries. Back in the past, the fact that even one country was able to achieve $1 trillion was a miracle in and of itself. Now it's just commonplace for a developed nation to have $1 trillion in GDP. But there's a fourth one, and this is the main one I would like to talk about, and that is political progress. Now, what does it mean to be politically progressive? It means to keep pushing in what direction you believe is best for a continual period. There is no stopping progress under this thought process. And so, a continual push for what is deemed to be the correct political system and ideas is approached. We most commonly see this with the liberals, and I'm using liberal as in the political science term, not as in the American term. The liberals push for more freedom, for more equality, for more brotherhood between peoples. They try to incorporate multiculturalism, rights, and equality into most things that they do. They also generally prefer self-determination. And while all these interact, the political one carries the most weight with every other one, because it is the one which, go figure, carries policy. And policy controls the others quite significantly. For example, a liberal constitution dramatically changes society. A liberal subsidy to certain enterprises results in many inventions being encouraged and funded. And a liberal approach to economics leads to, well, a liberal economy, full of a lot of private property rights and many regulations, specifically if it's a neoliberal. For classical liberals, you'll generally see less regulations because they are more focused on what is called natural rights versus human rights. It's basically the difference between a person being allowed to pick up a stick and say, "Oh, this looks like a nice sword, it's mine now," and a person being given sticks from someone else because the government says they're allowed to have sticks. But back to the main point, the issue with progress in regards to politics is it can never end. For a political system to be progressive, it does not stop at any one point. If you imagine politics like a track, let's say that this is our track here, and each of these rails is a different policy. For the progressive, there is no stopping. This train is a straight line. It has no end. There are no points. This is not a line segment. The track is a line. And what the liberal wants to do is keep going from policy to policy, down the track continually. The train does not stop. The politics does not end. Each thing keeps going until eventually the liberal achieves a perfect world. Since that perfect world is impossible, they understand that they will keep legislating basically until they die. Until the world has hit the heat death of the universe and all humanity ceases to exist. If they somehow manage to achieve their perfect world first, or at the very least what they recognize to be the closest to it, maybe they'll stop then, but it will not stop under conventional means. And so, as they see it, the world must get more free, more equal. There must be more brotherhood between peoples, and there must never be a rule by imperial powers, generally speaking. Now, how you define imperial powers depends, because, for example, the liberal will say, well, Russia's imperial power, and casually leave out their own country because it's convenient. Others will say, America's an imperial power, while casually leaving out their enemies. In truth, that's just how things go. It's a lot easier if you're trying to frame yourself as moral to claim to be anti-imperialist, though that does mean you eventually have to cover up, usually for your own countries. Or you must be so weak that you don't have any imperial possessions. Because, kind of how things work. It is not the weak who hold empires to make themselves strong. It is the strong who hold empires and can choose to lift up the weak or not. It all depends, of course, on policy, economics, and innovation. For example, the British Empire did wonders for many of its occupied territories. Now, those were not welcome changes a lot of the time, but for example, they reduced the caste system in India, they increased economic mobility in places like Egypt, and they also, among other things, founded the cultures which would become Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Specifically, they were the ones who brought in the English settlers who intermingled with the Afrikaners, creating what are now white South Africans. They're also responsible for Rhodesia, which was one of the wealthiest countries in Africa at the time that it was around, roughly until, it collapsed and became Zimbabwe. Also, someone appears to be very interested in getting lemons, so I'll be doing that while I speak with you. It should also be noted, this progress does have its problems. Number one is the obvious. See, there's what's called a ratchet effect. Let's say there's a gear. I know this gear is going to be horribly drawn, but work with me. Careful now, Bailey. So observe this horribly drawn gear. Now, what it wants to do is constantly go somewhere. Now, normally, it will go this way. But on occasion, it can go the other way. So how do you make sure it only goes the way you want it to? Well, you attach a ratchet. So what happens is, if it pushes this way, because there's no resistance, it'll just keep going. However, If it were to instead go this way, the ratchet would stop them. Thus, you can effectively control which way the gear is going. What this means is, in reference to progress, political reforms will almost inevitably lead to a reaction. For example, we witnessed this in 2016. Obama implemented a number of left-wing reforms. The result was many people distrusted the left-wing establishment, and so they went for Trump, a right-wing populist. But much of the things that Obama did implement were not removed. Last time I checked, Obamacare is still on the books. Along with that, gay marriage is still a thing, whether you like it or not. Personally, I don't mind it. I'm not really a person who really cares about such things. But regardless, it is the case that a lot of Obama's reforms stayed implemented. The ratchet effect. Simultaneously, we see the same with Biden. He had a lot of Trump's policies already there, and he kept the ones he liked and removed the ones he didn't, but there was still that constant tick towards one direction. And, since this world is largely liberal, the ratchet here helps the liberals. And so, the liberals control progress and define it. Here's the issue, that liberal beliefs do not work. Not in the long term. And progress, as a continual thing, cannot exist. Especially when your belief system involves self-determination. Here's the thing, it is possible to constantly expand freedom if you have an infinite group of people who are not free that you can expand into slowly or quickly. Issue is, if you're not willing to expand into them, well, freedom doesn't come. And your own people will already have been freed enough, and so where do you go from there? Nowhere. But if you demand progress, well, you look at whatever you can that you can change. For example, inequality. For the liberal, this is a great evil. For me, it's just life. Things are unequal. Welcome to reality. But what comes with it is the fact that if progress is something that must occur, if things must keep going, keep becoming more free, more equal, and brotherhood must be encouraged among the people of the earth, well then, an inequality between them, especially if they're different groups who need to be united in brotherhood, what do you think the liberal will want to do? They will want to equalize it. In effect, liberalism in decay is just socialism. It is this desire to communalize and unify everything into collective groups because that's the only way they can think of balancing everything out, because you cannot have collective equality without a collective control. You just have to in order to achieve what you wish. Because if everything is left free and independent, there will be inequalities created. And so you must control the people so you can dole out rewards and resources to ensure everyone gets an equal amount, or everyone gets an equal opportunity. Black people don't get enough? Alright, we're going to take from these people, give to these people. White people don't get enough. You're going to take from these people, give it to these people. It all depends who's more influential and who you wish to balance things out against. It is why, for example, in the United States, the left is often very, very against anti-Semitism, because Nazis. And they are viewed as a people under threat, as a minority. When it comes to Israel, though, they do not hide disdain. They straight up say Israel should not exist, and that Zionists are evil. Here's the issue. If they let the chosen successor win, the Jews will be wiped out of that area. Judea will be gone. There will be no Jews there. They will be killed. Welcome to extremism. Population, most of the Middle East after the Saudis had their influence. Certainly doesn't help that Iran's there and the Turks aren't much better. Seriously. The Middle East is like extremism central. The fact that we haven't wiped out half of those guys is kind of shameful, honestly. But, hey, they got oil. So, of course, spare them. And watch all the bodies pile, but, yeah. Regardless, when it comes down to it, the liberals wish to balance the board, something they cannot do without authoritarian controls. they effectively must abandon the liberalism in the name of progress. The Whig history cannot be true, because people do not naturally lean towards freedom. They lean towards comfort. And comfort can be achieved in a number of ways. Freedom is the most efficient and effective way. But a 5-minute conversation with the average voter can tell you why many of those freedoms aren't always the best. Seriously, sexual revolution was a freaking mistake. We give people freedom, in my opinion, because it is nature, because it is something that is inherent. However, to the liberal, this is just, part of the social contract. Something that can be taken away as is deemed necessary for the society to exist and thrive. Fact of the matter is, it can cause issues. The very view of the world that they use is incorrect. Progress is not inherent. It is not something that is guaranteed. In fact, we see commonly people will be subsumed by reaction only for progress to end up dulled for years, if not centuries. The fact that we have managed to make so much progress at all is, frankly, a miracle. But to the liberal, that is a sign that they are right. Now, are they? Again, no. But they like to believe it, and so they keep going. But the reality is, this cannot continue. Forever progress will not occur. And so, there's only one real conclusion. We must find a way to pick what we want as an outcome. Something reasonable, achievable, and not eternal. We cannot eternally go on the tracks. Eventually, there has to be a stop. Somewhere to get off the train. Somewhere to defend. A citadel, which will hold forever. Or at least until something new comes along that allows us to hold even further. If we cannot do that, then we will, inevitably, lead to our greatest destruction. A world where, because of our own hubris, we think we can control how the world goes. Well, it will not work. It cannot happen. And so, the citadel's needed. Some place to say, enough is enough. Somewhere to say, we don't need more. We're good here. We have to work on ourselves first. The liberal view cannot have this. Progress must continue. If the world is not perfect as it is, which it is not, then we must keep working to make sure it is, to get as close to perfection as they believe is possible. Because every little bit counts, but it will never, and can never, reach the equilibrium they so wish. Because, I hate to break it to them, but this political reform that they so desire will destroy every other method that they have in order to achieve what they desire. Controlling the resources and redistributing them in forms of welfare in order to make sure that people have an equal chance at survival destroys the economy. Simultaneously, regulating natural rights and getting rid of them in favor of human rights destroys the very concept of our society, our very constitution. And when everyone's distrusting of each other and can't afford anything, do you think we're going to be able to invent anything? No, of course not. That'll be impossible. And so the political system must be changed. We cannot have forever progress. At a certain point, it must be cut off. So, let's now decide when will that be.